If you have your Bibles this morning, if you'll grab them, go to Jonah chapter 4. Jonah 4. As a kid, I always file out to go to Kids Club. Jonah chapter 4. We'll get to that in just a moment. But I want to open with a very simple question here in just a second. When you're ready, I'm going to show you a picture of a group of famous teenagers, and I just want you to see if you know this group of famous teenagers. Okay, if you'll put it up. Do y'all know this gang? Who is this gang? Scooby-Doo, also known as like Mystery Inc., right? Okay, and so what are they famous for, this group of teenagers and their big dog? Solving mysteries. Good, you know exactly where I'm going with this. So if you've ever seen an episode of Scooby-Doo or any of the handful of movies that are out there, what typically happens at the end? After all their investigating and sleuthing and some hijinks, they get down to trapping the villain of the day, and what do? They take the mask off to reveal who the real culprit is. So it wasn't a ghost or a goblin. It was Farmer Ted the whole time or whatever, right? You know what I'm talking about? And then what does Farmer Ted or whoever the villain was, when they're finally unmasked and it's revealed they were the culprit the whole time, what do they always say? I would have gotten away with it too if it weren't for you meddling kids, right? You know what I'm talking about. Okay. Well, believe it or not, we're not solving mysteries this morning necessarily, but that same dynamic, that same exchange, that same idea of unmasking something is what we're going to see in our passage this morning in Jonah chapter 4. So as we continue in our series on the questions that God asked, today we're going to look at the life and the story of Jonah, and in particular, we're going to be in Jonah 4, looking at an episode of his life where he was dealing with some very serious anger. Very serious anger. But as it turns out, anger wasn't the real issue. Anger for Jonah was just a mask. So with some divine meddling on his own part, we're going to see how the Lord handles that. How he meets Jonah right where he was and addresses that anger, but he does so in a way that exposes, that unmasks the anger to show Jonah and us what was really going on inside so that he could deal with it there. But before we get into that and before we get into our passage, I want to first refresh our memories on who Jonah was and where he was and what he had been up to that leads to our passage this morning. So by a show of hands, how many of you have heard of Jonah before? Okay. Most of you associate Jonah with what type of animal? The whale. Okay. We're not talking about the whale today, and actually the whale is a small part of Jonah's story. But the bigger picture is Jonah was an Old Testament prophet, right? We all hopefully recognize that. But what we may not remember is that before the events recorded in the story that has his name on it, Jonah was an already decently well-known and somewhat successful prophet. Matter of fact, according to 2 Kings chapter 14, during a really rough period of history for the people of God, Jonah declared, he prophesied that God had not abandoned his people. Matter of fact, it was even better than that. God was going to restore and strengthen and even expand the borders of their land. And guess what happened? The prophecy came true. God did exactly what he said he was going to do through the mouth of Jonah. So that means that even before the events of our story today, Jonah already had experience as a prophet of God, and in a way that would have been meaningful, not just for his people, but for himself too. But that was back then. That was in the past. This is now. And Jonah's story is recorded in this story, is in a different time, in a different place, and the message that God had for him, that God wanted to speak through him, was totally different. See, according to Jonah chapter 1, this time God gave Jonah a message of judgment rather than deliverance. And this time it was to be for the people of Nineveh rather than his own people. So what do you know or what do you remember about Nineveh? If you didn't know, then you need to know that Nineveh was a very big, wealthy, powerful, and prominent city in the heart of the Assyrian Empire. And if you don't know anything about the Assyrian Empire, it was terrible in all the best and worst ways. It was rich, it was powerful, and it was cruel and oppressive too. And so just like the Assyrian Empire as a whole, Nineveh was like a capital city of wickedness. They were thoroughly and famously wicked. Matter of fact, the Assyrians took pride in how wicked they could be. We have historical records that declare how awful the Assyrians loved to be. They took pride in how cruel and brutal and ruthless they could be as they rose in power and as they bullied everyone around them. So If you can imagine then, by the time of Jonah, the people of God were sick and tired of Assyria. They didn't want anything to do with them. They were tired of being bullied by them and being oppressed by them. They were sick and tired of watching the Assyrians grow in power and prominence and wealth at the expense of everyone else. And they were sick and tired of always being afraid, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. They were sick and tired of being under the threat of Assyria's rise to power and dominance. So even though things turned around a little bit for Israel, even though they had an opportunity to win back some of their land, and they were able to, they still never forgot how much they both feared and hated the Assyrians. And that's what makes things so complicated for Jonah. See, as happy as Jonah would have been to know that God was finally going to judge the Assyrians, he didn't want to be the one to go tell them. In other words, Jonah was very pleased with the message that God had for Nineveh. He just didn't want to be the messenger. But you know how that story goes, don't you? What does Jonah do? Jonah chapter 1, when God says, I want you to take this message of judgment and I want you to preach it to the Ninevites. Jonah says, yes, sir, right away, God. He doesn't. What does he do? He runs as fast as he can, as far away as he can, in the opposite direction of where God was sending him. But you know that story too. It does not play out well for him. He makes a total mess of things before he is finally humbled and comes to his senses and obeys. And when he finally does that, when he finally goes to Nineveh and he preaches this message of doom and gloom, of judgment and wrath, that God had been watching them and God was holding them accountable, do you remember how those big, bad, nasty Ninevites responded? Did they laugh at him? Did they ignore him? Did they beat him up and torture him and threaten to kill him? No. What did they do? They actually listened, and they took it to heart, and they repented. And that's where our story picks up. So let's look at Jonah chapter 3. We're going to start in verse 10 and then read in the beginning of chapter 4. So Jonah chapter 3, verse 10 says, when God saw what they did, this is the Ninevites, how they turned from their evil way, it says God relented of the disaster that he said he would do to them, and he did not do it. Chapter 4, verse 1. But this displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was angry. And so he prayed to the Lord, and he said, O Lord, is not this what I said when I was yet in my own country? That is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish. For I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, and relenting from disaster. Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live. And the Lord said, do you do well to be angry? Okay, so what did Jonah think about God showing grace and mercy to the Ninevites? What did verse 1 say? He was not happy, right? He was very unhappy. Most of our English translations say something along the lines of Jonah was greatly or exceedingly displeased and that he was angry, but that's not a great translation. That doesn't quite capture the depth and the intensity of what Jonah was feeling here according to the original text. See, a more direct and literal translation of verse 1 reads, it was evil or wrong to Jonah. He considered it a very evil or a great wrong, and he was hot with anger. So do you see the difference? In other words, it's not that Jonah was disappointed. It's not that he was bummed. It's not that he got his hopes up and now he's frustrated. It's not even that Jonah is mad about what happened. It's that he's furious. He is so upset with things that it's burning within him like a fire. And what was it that he was so mad at? We don't have to guess, do we? What does he say in verse 2? Jonah shakes his fist at God, and he unloads a whole laundry list of complaints he has about God. That's verse 2. But what's so crazy about everything he's saying is everything he lists is a good thing, right? It's a remarkable thing. It's like being mad and throwing a fit because your spouse is too wonderful. Oh my goodness, how dare you be so good looking? I can't imagine why you're still so thoughtful and kind and hardworking. Do you see what I'm getting at? Can you imagine being that absurd? But that's exactly what Jonah's doing here. He's not just sulking or pouting, he's fuming. And he's taking it out on God as if God is the problem. But we can all see it, right? Jonah's not angry because God is too good. Jonah is angry because he thinks God is too good to the wrong people. And in case we're still not fully convinced just how upset he is, just how deeply and completely his anger had taken hold of him, verse 3 makes it clear. Jonah decides that if God is just going to be that way, then his life is not worth living. Bottom line, Jonah would rather die than see God be good to the people that he hates. So obviously Jonah's got a problem, right? He's got a big problem on his hands, but it's just not the one that he thinks it is. And so to help him start seeing that so he can start dealing with that, God asks him a very simple question. Verse 4, do you do well to be angry? Now, I don't want to overwork the text here, but did you notice what God didn't do? What he didn't say? As wrong and as inappropriate and as out of line as Jonah was here as he's throwing his fit, God doesn't shake his finger at him and scold him. God doesn't rebuke him. God doesn't give him a lecture. God doesn't even correct anything that he said. Instead, God meets Jonah right where he's at, and he asks him this very simple but searching question. So what is it that God is getting at here? I think on one level, God is asking very simply about the validity of Jonah's anger. He's basically saying, look, I can tell that you're upset. I can tell that you're angry, Jonah, but do you have a legitimate reason for it? Is your anger here in this moment, is it justifiable? But at the same time, I believe God is also asking Jonah about the value and the impact of his anger. Like, Jonah, is this sort of anger healthy? Is it helpful? Is it even necessary? Jonah, is this anger leading you to greater truth or wholeness or blessing? In other words, Jonah, more than being right or not, is this good for you to be this angry? See, what God is doing here is he's giving Jonah an opportunity to slow down and to reevaluate things, to consider both where his anger is coming from, but also where it's leading him. But Jonah doesn't care. He heard what God was saying. He heard what God asked him, but he's not really listening. And this is what happened next. Let's read now verses 5 through 9. On the heels of God's good question, Jonah went outside of the city and sat to the east of the city and made a booth for himself there. And he sat under it in the shade till he could see what would happen of the city. Verse 6, now the Lord appointed a plant and made it come up over Jonah, that it might provide shade over his head to save him from his discomfort. So Jonah was exceedingly glad because of this plant. But then when the dawn came up the next day, God appointed a worm that attacked the plant so that it withered. And when the sun rose, God appointed a scorching east wind and the sun to beat down on the head of Jonah so that he was faint. And Jonah asked then that he might die. And he said, it is better for me to die than to live. But God said to Jonah, again, do well to be angry for this plant? And Jonah said, yes, I do well to be angry enough to die. So what happened? Verse 5 says that Jonah left the city and he camped out in a spot where he could watch and wait to see how things would play out. Because maybe it was all a sham. Like maybe the Ninevites were just faking it and God would see through it and he would smite them anyway. At least that's what Jonah was hoping for. But in reality, Jonah was just being stubborn, wasn't he? And so we see once again that God is more than willing to let us learn the hard way if we insist. Because what does God do? It says first, God provides this shade for him in his little makeshift tent, which makes him almost like embarrassingly happy. Did you pick up on that right in the middle of the passage? It's like Jonah is acting like a moody toddler with these mood swings that he has. Earlier, he was exceedingly angry, irrationally angry. And now he flips it to the other end because of a little bit of shade. He's exceedingly happy. He's back and forth. He's like a roller coaster. But the gladness doesn't last because that was never the point. See, even though Jonah may have been done with God and his ways, God was not done with Jonah. And there's a little bit of wordplay that takes place here. Remember earlier, a more literal translation of the word anger here is actually hot or burning. And so what does God do to reveal what's really in Jonah's heart? He turns up the heat, literally, doesn't he? God sends a worm to destroy the plant that was providing shade. And then to make it worse, God sends this scorching wind mixed with the burning sun to finally get Jonah's attention. And when Jonah can't take it anymore, when he's finally at his boiling point and his breaking point, he cries out to God that he would rather just die than have to deal with all this trouble that God keeps sending his way. And there again, God speaks. And what does he say? Pretty much the same exact question as before. He says, again, do you do well to be angry? Now that I've got your attention, do you do well to be angry? Again, is it right for you, Jonah, to be this angry? Is it good for you to be this angry? And in this case, the second time, I think there's another layer to it. There's also this element of, can't you see yet what your anger is doing to you? Because what does God include in this second question? The plant. He says, do you do well to be angry about the plant? And how does Jonah respond? He's in so deep now he can't get back out. He's doubling down. Absolutely. Absolutely, I'm right to be angry. Yeah, this is good for me. Matter of fact, God, I'm so angry that I might as well just die. Now, do we see what Jonah still can't see? Can we see just how much his anger has hardened his heart and it's twisted his mind? Can we see that at this point, anger is not just something that he's feeling, it's something that he's choosing. Even though it is burning him up from the inside out, Jonah just won't let it go. Well, let's see how then the story ends. Let's read verses 10 and 11. The Lord responds and says, you pity the plant for which you did not labor, nor did you make it grow, which came into being in a night and perished in a night? Should I not then pity Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 120,000 people who do not know their right hand from their left, and also much cattle? So what's God getting at here? Can you see what he's doing? He's putting things in perspective, isn't he? He's meeting Jonah right where he's at, right there in the dirt and the sweat of his rotten attitude, and he's using that to help make his point. So God is saying, look, let me get this straight, Jonah. You're upset, devastated even about this plant, a plant that you didn't create, that you didn't cause to grow, that you didn't take care of, a plant that you just met yesterday. You're falling apart this much over a single plant? And this is where God shows his hand in the most humbling and yet gracious way. Because not only is he showing Jonah the foolishness and error of his ways, he's also showing Jonah the goodness and glory of God's ways. So he says, Jonah, think about it. If you're right in doing that, am I not even more right to care about the great many people of Nineveh? People who are so lost and wayward, they're like reckless children. And am I not right to even care for all the animals that are found there too? In other words, what God is communicating, what God is revealing, what God is reminding Jonah and us is that God isn't just the sovereign creator of all things who can do whatever he wants. That is part of it. But what he's also showing us is that he's a sovereign creator who loves and cares for that which he's created. All of it. Every last bit of it. And he never stops working for their good. And that, Jonah, is what you need to come to terms with. The real issue, Jonah, isn't out there. It's not the Ninevites. And the real issue isn't up there. It's not with God. Jonah, the real issue you have is right here in your heart. Jonah, you've been so consumed by your anger that you have set yourself at odds with the very love and grace and mercy and goodness and glory of God. This is where your anger has taken you, and you are stuck. Let's be honest. We can laugh at Jonah for all his silliness and his foolishness, but is this not so much of our story too? And there's so much that we can learn here that reflects us and our own struggles. So even if we're not a prophet of God, even if we haven't been sent like Jonah to go preach a message to someone else, I'm sure we can all still relate to Jonah's story in some way. But in case you're not sure what that might look like for you this morning, here are a few big ideas I want you to consider and think through prayerfully. Here's the first one. If you're taking notes, please write this down. You need to master your anger, or it will master you. You need to master your anger, or it will master you. And it's a cruel master, isn't it? Think about anger like fire. Anger, just like fire, can be good and helpful when it's kept under control, but it can then become incredibly harmful and destructive if it burns out of control. And we all know that, don't we? We don't have to think deeply about that. We have all known someone, or we know someone right now, or we are that someone who's just angry all the time. And it's miserable. If you've known someone like this who's just angry all the time, their anger has mastered them. It doesn't really matter what situation they find themselves in. You just know someone or something's going to get burned by it, right? It can be big or small. It can be important or unimportant. It can be someone they love or someone they don't love. It doesn't matter. Everyone and everything is in danger of being burned by the anger of someone who can't get it under control. And it doesn't matter if they're otherwise a good or a nice or successful person. If they've got a temper, if they're a hothead, if they've got some unresolved anger issues, you know what the Bible says about that? The Bible says they're a fool. And they're going to keep doing foolish things. They're a fool, and they're only going to keep running into trouble because of their anger. It's going to happen at home. It's going to happen at work. It's going to happen at play. It's going to happen at the store. It's going to happen in traffic. It's going to happen everywhere they go, because everywhere they go, they're taking their anger with them. It's a fire that doesn't stop burning. And in case we're still not convinced, the Bible also says the anger of man cannot produce the righteousness of God. And even more convicting, unresolved anger, the Bible says, is a foothold for the devil. In other words, if you let your anger master you, if you let your anger lead you, it's not going to lead you in a good direction. It's not going to lead you towards life and blessing with God. Actually, it's going to lead you the other direction. It's only going to lead to greater and greater problems and harm and destruction. So you got to master your anger before it masters you. And that leads to my second point. A great first step in learning to master your anger is realizing that anger often masks the real issue. Anger often masks the real issue. See, anger in and of itself is not the problem. Anger in and of itself is a God-given emotion and response that indicates, that lets us know something's not right. But if we never figure out what that is, if we never figure out what is causing our anger, what our anger is a response to, then we'll never know how to appropriately deal with it. So what will end up happening is we will just spend all our time putting out fire after fire after fire. Think again about the example of Jonah. Yes, he absolutely was angry. And yes, we see that he takes his anger out on God, which is a problem. But all that was just the secondary, outward-facing problem. What was Jonah's real issue? As God is working to expose it and pull off the mask of his anger, what do we find inside? Hatred towards the Assyrians. An overinflated sense of justice that Jonah decides who deserves what. Jonah also had deep pride and self-righteousness, and ultimately, his deepest issue was bitterness and resentment that God just won't do what he wants him to do. That's what God is getting at. God is working to unmask Jonah's anger and expose all those things so that Jonah could see them and deal with them before they consumed him. But what about you? What about you in your life today? Maybe you're aware that you've got an anger problem. But have you ever tried to unmask it? See what's underneath it? See what's lurking behind it? A lot of times people who are angry, their anger is just covering fear. They're scared. Or they're insecure about something. They're worried about something and they don't know what to do about it. Or they're scared and worried about something and they just don't know how to handle it. And so it comes out as anger. For other people, if you take the mask of anger off, it's pain on the inside. They've been hurt. They've been wronged in some way, and they were never able to process it or to deal with it or to resolve it. And so all that comes out is anger, and it's a defense mechanism. They're guarding themselves. They don't want to be hurt again. But sometimes it's something you'd never expect. Have you ever heard this old saying? I sat with my anger long enough until it told me its name, grief. You been there? You're angry, you're frustrated, everything's setting you off. You feel like you're just on edge all the time. But if you slow down enough to look beneath the anger, you discover that it's because you're grieving. You have unresolved grief over something, and it's spilling out as anger. So whatever it might be in your life, you got to look, you got to work, you got to try to find out to see it for what it really is so you can deal with what really is the problem. Otherwise, it's going to keep bubbling up and spilling out as anger, and it's going to burn you and everyone around you. But it doesn't have to be that way, because there's a better way. And that leads me to my final point today. You don't need better anger management skills. You need a new heart. You don't need better anger management skills. What you need is a new heart. Isn't that the underlying message and invitation of the entire chapter here in Jonah 4? God's not trying to correct Jonah's bad behavior. God's not trying to get Jonah to play nice. God is working to reveal what's down deep in Jonah's heart. And God is doing that not to shame him, but to show him the danger that he's in, and that it doesn't have to be that way. And God does that ultimately not just by showing Jonah Jonah's heart. God does that ultimately by showing Jonah God's heart. In other words, God is saying, Jonah, I know you're angry and it's destroying you. But Jonah, do you know that you're angry because your heart doesn't match mine? And what's the remedy for that? It's not about trying harder and doing better. It's about total surrender to the Lord. And my friends, that's where the good news comes in. See, God doesn't give us a list of things to do to get back into his good graces. What God does is he takes the initiative to bring us back into his good graces. In other words, God doesn't just clean out and then clean up our hearts. God makes our hearts new. And he does that most fully, most completely, most finally through Jesus Christ our Lord by the power of his own Spirit. So this morning, if you're uncomfortable in this place, because you came in thinking you were going to laugh at Jonah and you're leaving wondering what's really in my heart. If you're in this place today and maybe it's anger, maybe it's something else, but you know things aren't right with you in the Lord. There's ugliness in here. Then I hope you hear today the answer isn't to look outward. It's not even ultimately to look inward. It's to look upward to the God who loves you, who's made a way for you, who's not waiting for you to get your act together. He shows you that you don't have your act together so that you will come home to him in his great love and his power. He's the one who makes your heart new. If you would just turn to him and receive it.